And I see crypto tools already providing sort of the sovereign stack, where like I don't see us as like individuals just living in the mountains, but I see the sovereign stack that allows you to kind of collaborate with your fellow, humans in like a really positive way and not this sort of
Hell
communist
yeah.
way.
Hell yeah.
All right, what's up, everybody? This is Other Life. I am Justin Murphy. I just wanted to let you know that I write a free newsletter to thousands of people every week. It's where I publish my best work, I share events that you can come to, and much more. We have an insane private community around the newsletter, and it's free. Go check it out. Just go to otherlife.co. That's otherlife.co. When you subscribe, I'm going to send you a folder of PDFs that contain all of my personal highlights from a bunch of my favorite books that I've read over the years. So you'll get a million insights after just a few minutes of browsing these PDFs, really. They're really special to me, and I just figured I'd share them with you all. So that's otherlife.co, otherlife.co.
All right, Phil, thanks for joining me today.
Yeah.
I was very intrigued by the talk you gave last night at the Urbit meetup here in Austin. You were talking about network states versus network age is what you like to call this current moment. I thought that's as good a place to start as any. What is the difference between this idea of the network state, which a lot of people probably have heard of, and your kind of larger vision for the network age? What is the network age?
Yeah, so I'd say like the network state is of course like Balaji's book that he just came out with, and it kind of like follows a long track of other works that came out, like Sovereign Individual, a lot of Curtis's writings, or Curtis Yarvin's writing, like Patchwork especially really hits on that theme. And so I think it like kind of it slots into kind of an existing set of literature on just kind of like what's the next step for humanity, what's the next, how are we going to be organizing, what are going to be our tools, what are going to be the themes of these next ages. It's just funny he like calls it this, network state, because like states, if you read Sovereign Individual and you buy their thesis, which I think actually like a ton of us have read Sovereign Individual, and most people are just like, yeah, it was pretty much right. Like it called Bitcoin in 1997, so it's just very early. And I think like what that did such a good job of is like laying out the kind of general characteristics and themes of an entire age. So what was like hunter-gatherer, what was agricultural, medieval, industrial, late industrial. And yeah, I just see this as like all the necessary components of entering a new age are there. But to me, like, and a lot of the other writers, it's like Patchwork's all about the decline of the state. Sovereign Individual is all about the decline of the welfare state. So why would you write a book in 2022 about calling it network state and put so much emphasis on that, when state was something that, kind of emerged in the industrial period where states became powerful, especially under, Napoleon. And so for me, like, we're clearly entering a new age. We can kind of go into the logic of that new age. And I think, honestly, like, states will be an increasingly minor part of our existence. And so that's like my main issue with sort of Balaji's take. I agree with Sovereign Individual and with Curtis that like we're definitely entering a new period. Why I kind of like the term network age is it's actually quite hard to describe this new age like very succinctly. Usually ages are named long afterwards. Like the industrial age, people weren't saying that in 1700. They like said that in like 1900. And so it's somewhat interesting for us to be even naming this age so early. But the themes I see are kind of like networks are critical. It's almost like somewhat tribal. Like, so you have Sovereign Individual that puts that emphasis on individual, and you have network state that puts the emphasis on the state. But what we're actually seeing is more like organic, somewhat more tribal organization of groups like Milady. That formed a tribe organically. Praxis is forming a tribe organically. A lot of Urbit expatting that Aleph is helping to organize is happening sort of organically in this more like tribal situation where the tribes are also both networked across tribes. And tribes, like, yeah, people think of it as like tribalism, and that's terrible, but like tribes are like a very old form of human organization, and they're actually fairly scalable. Like they're nicely fractaled, and they also build up. Like the way the native Rhodesian tribes worked was, one chief was very local, and then he reported up to the chief of chiefs, who reported up, and there was like 4 layers of chiefs. So you could actually get up to represent at a national level through this tribal situation. And so we see sort of like that type of unit. It's also happening internationally, where you can be connected now and be working across borders without any issues whatsoever.
So some of the background here for people listening is that you're basically right now kind of romping around the world with this crew of Urbit hackers. Basically, you are all working on Urbit in Ukraine, and then the war kicked off, and you went to places like Mexico and El Salvador. You all have been all around, and so you're kind of doing this international nomadic thing, except not as isolated individuals. You're working on a much larger project, Urbit. You have these kind of shared goals, and you do kind of move as a tribe.
Yep.
So that's some of the practical background, I guess, for people watching or listening. That's where you're coming from. And maybe also just for the audience, take us back a little bit. Maybe like, who are you? What brought you to this stage? I think you were kind of like a Harvard finance kind of guy. What was your background before you became like a roaming crypto cowboy?
Yeah. So let's see. For me, I was working, Harvard class of 2013. Went into consulting after that, pretty like sort of econometric, stats heavy, mostly consulting for pharma companies. And then I worked in healthcare IT in a mega corp for about 10 months, and then had this opportunity to jump ship, work at this healthcare startup that was kind of trying to do sort of like a patient-driven revolution in healthcare. So there were all these new APIs coming out in healthcare. It's this really exciting time where like suddenly you could get access to cost data and to patient-level data across any organization. So it was a cool time just like tap into those APIs, start trying to execute this new vision for U.S. healthcare. Unfortunately, and it was like it had done it with a crypto raise, although it did it at the very beginning of 2018. And so
right at the top,
basically. And I remember my introduction to crypto was I had bought some ETH in 2017. I'd liked it. I was like, oh, ETH's going to change the world. And then I was like, Bitcoin, I had that classic thing where I'm like, oh, Bitcoin's like the legacy coin that's like going to go under, so I shouldn't buy that one. I should buy the new one. So quite naive in that way. And I think part of that was also just seeing the top in 2018, because I went to Bitcoin Miami 2018. It was insane. Everyone was just like doing coke, and there was like strippers at all the parties. And I was just like, this doesn't seem like a legit project. So that was my experience. And then, we raise a couple million, and then basically all the crypto markets tank. We were sort of stupidly left in crypto. I'd say for startups, raising crypto, but like really you want to be uncorrelated to the market, because that's when it's gonna be hard to raise. So like you should probably mostly have fiat if you're a startup, and then like, as an individual, I now invest in crypto, but as a startup, you kind of want your treasury in something that isn't gonna be correlated with like the market. So I did that for almost 2 years, and then it was kind of a weird time because like crypto had gone down. The founder who I signed up with, a really great guy, Andy, he kind of just like ghosted on the project. And then I was sort of like de facto CEO, but with no product market fit, trying to find how to make money off of these APIs that were opening up. So I did that, and then ended up having to wind down that company, and was just sort of like watching to see sort of the crypto themes play out, because I just sort of instinctively thought there was something there. But I couldn't quite see it until COVID. When COVID, in my free time working, I'd gone back to kind of megacorp healthcare IT as like a sort of data science analytics manager. And in 2020, I'd been running these Airbnbs in my spare time that I'd bought. And then COVID comes, everyone cancels. And this sort of value-based investing thing that I had sort of confidence in that would get me to an early retirement, I had to question that thesis, and I had to dive into it. And I had studied a lot of econ as an undergrad. I always kind of liked Austrian economics. It was just seemed true. And then I did a massive deep dive through actually Saifedean. So I'd read Bitcoin Standard in 2020. Yeah. I was like, this book's awesome. It was actually, my brother had recommended it to me because he was sort of orange pilling me at the time and helping me find the correct things to read. And so I got very orange pilled, went down this sort of Austrian economics hole, and was basically oh, the dollar is actually just deteriorating as a unit of account and sort of a money. And oh, Bitcoin's probably the next thing. So I became sort of a raging Bitcoin maxi, sold my houses. And I was already living abroad at that point because of being able to work remotely because of COVID. So I was already working out of Mexico City. And then I got introduced into Urbit on my second trip to Mexico City. I loved my first trip so much that I was immediately planned a return trip a few months later and invited my entire family. I'm from a huge family. Tim Luck runs the company Ukbar. And so I kind of pitched Mexico City to him. I don't think he had been, or maybe he had been briefly because he used to travel a lot. And so he visited from Ukraine and brought a few Urbit guys, Sarpin and Tondis, to Mexico City, and I started like being like, okay, what's next after Bitcoin? Like, okay, Bitcoin wins as money,
right?
But then like, what replaces this kind of computing experience I hate, where it's kind of like I have to like patch a ton of apps together. I don't have a unified experience. It's not like customizable, and like and just like getting control of it. Like if you want to have your own server, you just have to become like a Linux admin. That sucks, and so it's really boring. And so then I was like getting pitched a lot in person in Mexico City on Urbit, and then I like listened to Urbit from the inside out with Ted Blackman, who's now a very close friend of mine. I know he was on the Other Life podcast as well.
Yeah, like 3 years ago or something. Yeah,
twice actually. Yeah, I watched that one actually.
Once a long time ago.
Yeah, that's
Once
actually
a long time ago.
Yeah, on YouTube, and it's like Ted's in like some outside setting. Like your production value is way higher now. You've come a long way.
I'd like to think so.
Yeah, I forgot about that one actually. Yeah. So I actually watched that one, and then I listened to Urbit from the inside out, and I was like running in like the mountains of Mexico, listening to like the soothing sound of Ted Blackman's voice, and I was like, oh, this Urbit thing sounds awesome. It's not just, it sounds like exactly what we need. The sort of sound computing. It's computing you own, and importantly, sort of over time, I realized like the big thing missing in Web 2 is sort of owning the social graph. So like you have like currently I have 200 logins across the internet.
Right.
So each person has me as like a line in their database, and that's like fine in like a WeChat type world where like if you're fine with WeChat, but where they can basically integrate all the main services you want into one app. So that kind of works for WeChat in China. It never took off in the US. I think Tim's take in Web 0, his podcast about the issues with Web 2 are accurate, where it's more a regulatory thing, where Facebook did want to launch their own currency. And so, yeah, I got basically very into Urbit as sound computing and kind of this whole thesis of we need sound computing in order to make this future age, this network age, a positive age. And it kind of goes back to the sort of, almost like the Sovereign Individual talked about it. The foreword of that was written by Peter Thiel, the edition I read, where he talks about sort of this AI future versus the crypto future, and they're sort of the good, AI bad, crypto good.
Right.
And, I like, it's somewhat oversimplified, but I kind of agree with that overall thesis where it's like, I do not want to live in communist China. That's like not the future I envision. And I see crypto, I can kind of go into it, but I see crypto tools already providing sort of the sovereign stack, where like I don't see us as like individuals just living in the mountains, but I see the sovereign stack that allows you to kind of collaborate with your fellow humans in like a really positive way, and not this sort of communist way.
Hell yeah. Okay, so let's talk about this full stack, because you are working on a company called Aleph, which is basically trying to really make the most of this network age, right? As you're kind of roaming the world with your Urbit hacker buddies, building cool shit, hanging out, traveling the world, you are seeing ways in which this is going to generalize, right? This is exactly. And you're kind of extrapolating into the future. What is your thesis about that future? How does this manifest into buying and sharing land, buying and sharing resources of different kinds, and how does that integrate with computing? Like, paint the whole picture of what is the thesis of Aleph for building out this network age.
Yeah, and it's it's a lot. So I'll try to do the best I can on it. It's basically, we saw this diaspora from Silicon Valley. So previously, a lot of the energy and tech was just concentrated in Silicon Valley, and even the next best one, like Boston had a .com boom as well. I'm from Boston originally. My dad had worked as general counsel at a few big internet companies. He actually had the largest IPO. It was 2001, so the very end of that bubble, which is probably why it was the largest IPO until Facebook's. So he was IPO manager for that company. So I sort of saw the .com bubble firsthand, and when it burst, it was really just Silicon Valley kind of survived that bubble bursting, and it just kept growing. Like Silicon Valley became more of a thing, and I kept watching it. My ex-wife had gone to Berkeley, so I'd go to out to the Bay Area, both personally but also for work a fair amount. Mm-hmm. And Silicon Valley had all that energy, and it wasn't until COVID where that energy has really dispersed. And kind of the overall thesis is like, developer talent is more important than oil today. So oil more or less dictated the 20th century. We had the petrodollar. Developer talent is sort of the new resource of the future. This is what like actually matters. Developer talent and what you do, which is just sort of helping people distill all this information that's out there and telling them like, hey, what information actually matters, because like there is information, some people call it information age, and that was a good term I think for the last 20 years, where it's like it was kind of overwhelming. It's like I could find this on Google, but it's too hard to find it. And so there's it's sort of these two pairings between people who can distill information and people who can create software. It's this general thesis of software is eating the world. But interestingly, the people who are making that software have now spread out, and they spread out abroad. There's a ton of them, and I can kind of talk about sort of the hubs for that. It's like Lisbon, Mexico City, Costa Rica, for a lot of the developer expat hubs, Medellin as well. But they've also spread out across the US. What Aleph's helping to do is connect that with a digital backend, so that you're basically, think of it as membership in basically the block masons, the people building this kind of networked age.
Block masons, nice.
Yeah, it's actually was the name of Tim's ICO in 2017. So I like that term. It's you're building.
And so you want Aleph to be that block masons.
Yeah, essentially the membership club for block masons.
But it also involves a kind of live-in experience, right? It's like a network of hotels, almost like high-end hotels. You're thinking about it.
Yeah, exactly. So what we've realized from just like living this lifestyle is that a lot of the you could rent Airbnbs together, but at a certain point, like we're right now in Austin, and there's this really cool assembly capital hub here. So like it's just a hangout spot. You kind of want these hubs that help kind of sort of concentrate that energy, because the big issue now is that it has spread out, and what we saw with like, for example, the Tlon offsite. So Tlon, the original company on Urbit, they did their offsite in Mexico City when I was there this winter, and there was just so much energy from gathering in person. Like people, like there's so much happening the velocity of ideas accelerates, and there's sort of a need for that coordination level, because developers, as sort of Google and Silicon Valley knew, they're not great at kind of building. They want to focus on coding a lot of the time, and they want the kind of the other aspects sort of done as a service for them. Right. That's why you see like food at Google's headquarters. That's why sometimes they look like almost like amusement parks.
Right. So you want to basically build this amazing live-in experience where everything other than coding and hanging out with the boys is taken care of for.
Exactly. And so that, they can really be more productive. It's sort of like, it's honestly what Silicon Valley had kind of like largely done. It's just the fact like, for many reasons, Silicon Valley has kind of collapsed. And so you kind of create more, kind of a little bit smaller, more granular levels with also more flexibility, because you're just working from your laptop anyway. So instead of just like having to be at Google's headquarters all the time, it's just like, okay, you could work from like any cafe around, but you still have that sort of almost like clubhouse to connect. And that's huge I've seen so much, like smart contracts on Urbit, the Uqbar work. I just saw that like coming together due to two people hang out in the same apartment in Mexico City. And so like we kind of lost that when we went remote, and now we're kind of starting to stitch that back together. But with some, I'd say a lot of innovations on top of what Silicon Valley had done.
I know that one of the inspirations for Aleph is the business Celia, is it?
Selena.
Yeah. I keep saying it wrong. You're right. So this is a kind of role model business for you in a sense. I never heard of it until you mentioned it in the presentation. So maybe just explain, what is that business? Describe the business model, and then maybe we can work from there.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. So like, as I mentioned, I'd run Airbnbs in my free time. So I had 3 Airbnbs going in Boston. And so I was always really interested in this kind of sharing economy. It was like really fascinating to me. But I was slowly like, didn't love Airbnb over time. And Selena, looking at what they did, they basically recognized the issues in like, there's sort of this bridge between WeWorks and hotels, where it's like actually what people want is way more. They wanted more of the Silicon Valley thing. They wanted a more like full set of services where it's somewhat curated, so they know they're hanging out with like better than just a hostel crowd.
Right.
They also want it cleaner than a hostel, so they basically did a high-end hostel in terms of living, but with a lot more investment into the co-working spaces.
And they're big, right?
They're big. They're at $1 billion valuation.
Yeah, it's insane.
And they open a new location every week, and their locations are basically, it's a mix between like a hotel, basically a hostel and a WeWork. That's what they've mixed.
And so how would Aleph be different? Like, do you see it as basically just kind of replicating the same model and taking some of that market share? Or like, where does things like crypto enter in and cause an innovation relative to that model?
Yeah, great question. So, they're a great cash flow positive business. What they're missing is like the curation of the network. So the crazy thing about Urbit is just how well people get along. And it's similar with like actually with ETH. Like we've had a lot of the top sort of adjacent people to Urbit are ETH developers. And they've like ETH has innovated really far in terms of doing kind of better community events, like the ETH meetups in like Paris that just happened. The ETH conferences are very social. They're way better in many ways than actually the Bitcoin conferences. I could go into what I saw about sort of Bitcoin versus ETH. It's a hot topic, but like the main thing with Aleph is basically realizing that like it's not just about providing the physical thing. It's also about with digital assets, with tools of crypto, like you can actually monetize that network. Like a lot of the values of SF wasn't just the scenery. There's a lot of beautiful scenery. It was the fact you had gotten a network effect of all those amazing minds in SF, the mix between the entrepreneurs, the developers, and the capital. Those are like three core things. The fourth thing that's actually critical in this age is also more cultural, actually. It's more related to like what we did with the Mars Review Party or with Urbit Week. It's like really bringing in the influencers from across the space. That's what Milady did so well. Like Milady raves, Praxis parties. It's bringing this fourth group that's really interesting because we're not just trying to like replace everything with software. We're also trying to improve the aesthetic. Like the 20th century was pathetic aesthetically. Like the last good thing was like Art Deco in like 1920, which I love, and that's why everyone's moving to Mexico City. But like I think we really need a renaissance across art here. And so Aleph's innovation is basically more curation of the network. So you're not just like when I go to a Selena, it's a beautiful space, but the chance of me actually making a friend is low compared to like an Urbit meetup.
I see.
And so the KPIs are more like, did you meet your business partner through this like hangout here? Did you get capital invested from hanging out here? How many like close friends did you make? And like even like how many girlfriends did you get? Like did you find your girlfriend through this?
Right.
Interestingly, that's actually one of the biggest problems for like, the entire dev space.
Right. Of course. Well, probably want to reframe that to did you meet your wife there, right? You don't.
Oh, yeah.
If you're optimizing for girlfriends, like number of girlfriends, that's not going to end well.
No, you end up with like Mayeen or like sex padding and like this like kind of depressing phase. So no, I totally agree with you. Did you meet your wife through there is like a core KPI that I want to hit on.
Yeah.
Aleph, and like I loved that about the Praxis interview you did with Dryden. Like he talked about those KPIs and like those are critical. Like what are your KPIs?
So something that you and I talked about last night was something we agree about is that we tend to think, you and I, that as the network state or the network culture, the network age grows, whatever you want to call it, at a certain threshold, it's not going to be integrated with the system of states like Balaji seems to think. In his book, one of the key kind of criteria for a successful network state, according to his perspective, is that it would be recognized diplomatically by other governments. When I read that, I was kind of like, well, that's quite beside the point. I was like, once there's a successful network state, it's going to be zooming past all currently existing governments.
Yeah.
They're not even, it might not even
that
be.
That sentence really bothered me.
It might not even be legible to governments, right? Especially if it's shrouded behind like zero knowledge tech, right? It's like whatever this network state is, when it really takes off, it's going to be so much crazier and bigger and weirder in ways we can't really foresee that probably currently existing governments are going to be left in the dust is the way that I would think about it. And you tend to agree. So talk more about that and talk more about how, what kinds of wagers are you making when it comes to building out your project? What do you expect? How do you expect that to manifest in interesting ways that maybe other people haven't thought about?
Yeah, so I totally agree. I think that was like, and like, that's not like a small thing about Balaji. Like when you say that, all of the discussions now that we have on like Telegram and Urbit groups about the network state, they always are like, oh, but you're not trying to be recognized as a country, so you're not really a network state. And it's like, okay. Then...
Seems like a weird goal. Yeah,
it's like a goal to like, and so my question would be like, why do you even want to be recognized by a state?
Right, you want sovereignty, right? You want freedom, power, whatever you want to call it. You want to leave the state behind. You want to escape. You want to escape its clutches.
That like we could list out. Like people want to get married. People want to have friends. People want to be able to start companies. People want to be able to work for companies that treat them
People want to be able to do whatever they want, get rich, don't have to pay taxes, travel the world, but also like have a stable, happy, wholesome family as well. Right?
Yeah, exactly. That's like more or less like the lifestyle we already sort of achieve, and so we're just trying to scale that as a service. And so Yeah, I would say like why the state? Like the question should be like, sovereign individual already laid out why the state's losing power. So like the question for Balaji would be like, why do you see diplomatic recognition as important? Why would we even want that? And like something that came up in discussions on Urbit around that topic was like, what do we actually want? One is like, well, we don't want to be like fucked with by a state, right? Mm-hmm. Like we want to like have like security. Interestingly, a lot of countries are already competing for developer talent. Like Portugal's made a huge play here. Everyone's launching digital nomad visas. Like, guess what they're trying to target? It's you as a software developer, or it's you as like someone with a good platform who has a high enough income to not like be a burden to their economy. So like, I think we're up to 30 countries with digital nomad visas, and that's like accelerating very quickly. So we see the trend there, and like, so we don't want to be messed with. So we do need states that treat us well. But if the state doesn't treat us well, this is an interesting thought experiment. Like, Ukraine got invaded, right? And so what happened there, like my brother was living in Kyiv. I had already left to go to Mexico because it's cold in Kyiv in the winter. So I'd left, the timing worked great. So I didn't get stuck in the subway like Sarpin did for 5 days.
Oh no.
Yeah, that was funny. Not funny, but I think it really matured him in a great way, actually. Like I saw Sarpin just as the war hero.
Stuck in the subway?
Oh yeah!
Wow.
Like bomb sheltering in Kyiv subway for 5 days before he was able to get a train out. And the train out, this was the first train out in 5 days.
I got to get him on the podcast in Miami. I'll see about it.
Yeah, Sarpin. I mean, he's really like he's a war hero now.
He's funny.
Sarpin was like the second Urbiter I really met, and it's like such a weird second one to get because he's just like an awesome Urbiter, but also like he Urbit pills really effectively. A lot of people he doesn't quite. Yeah. He's not quite the person to Urbit pill me, like Ted did a better job of that, okay. But he Urbit pilled so many. And so like what happened there with Ukraine, right? So in the old days, if you have to flee, like your business is just like fucked, like it's gone. Now with the internet and especially with crypto, it's like, look, we have the store of value in Bitcoin. So my brother just like literally drove across the border with his family. It took 12 hours, it's somewhat stressful, but like he gets across the border, he has all his money. He's set up in Italy, Ukbar's business, he's CEO of Ukbar. It wasn't affected. And so that's so different. And it's like, what happened there? What are these tools? And it's like, well, one is all of your value, all of like the value is accruing digitally. So like what actually matters is just like his network of contractors around the world who work for Ukbar. And then him personally, like, he has one apartment in Kyiv, but that's a tiny fraction of the net worth. Everything else is mobile. So you drive across, it's in your brain, and you're across the border. So it's just like being mobile now is easy. There's not this like, you're not like the poor refugee, like waiting to be like let in. And so like the Ukrainian crypto networks, for example, they all were able to pay the bribes to get across and get into Lisbon. So we just see like a completely different logic here, and Sovereign Individual kind of laid out this logic well. I think maybe it's worth talking just a little bit about like crypto tools, okay. Because like crypto tools are really poorly understood, and I think like you understand them and a lot of people in Urbit understand them, but more broadly I see a lot of confusion. Like people still ask me like, what is Bitcoin good for? And I'm like, well, first off, tokens clearly let you bootstrap networks. So being able to bootstrap networks and get to scale is massive. Like Bitcoin got to $1 trillion without VC funding. That is a huge deal. I'm not sure why it's not talked about more, because like it's not just Bitcoin that did it. Milady's doing it. Like you could literally do this at like the individual creator level, and we talked a little bit about that before we started recording, like doing ERC20 tokens as even an individual. I was like chatting with this girl in London who was releasing an album soon, and like we went like deep into crypto. It was funny because she's just like a Christian worship singer, but she got like really crypto pilled, and I was getting excited because like suddenly that insight like clicked for me, like why DAOs.
Right. So the equity distribution aspect basically is a very legitimate use case.
Yep. So, for example, like Facebook wanted to issue equity to everyone. SEC moved to outlaw that. And even if SEC hadn't moved to cap the number of shareholders that they could issue equity to, it still was going to be logistically hard because equity is tied to each jurisdiction. It's sort of like fiat money. It's tied to each jurisdiction. So each jurisdiction is issuing it. Each country is issuing their own securities laws around equity. And so if you want to issue as a multinational corporation like Airbnb, if you want to issue equity to all your hosts like they had planned and announced, you're going to have to learn securities laws for like 200 countries. That's not fun.
Right.
That's expensive. It's slow. What we see with sound money is like, man, it just gets me into another aspect with sound money. Like, look at Bitcoin. It's like whether or not you use it as store value, it's working as a means of payment. Like, I'm buying my coffee in El Salvador with Bitcoin. I pay my contractor in Kosovo in Bitcoin because it moves at the speed of light. And Jack Mahler's, that's like a whole tangent. I think I'll very quickly go down. It kind of connects actually to the frontier as well, which is a really interesting topic. So Jack was basically like all in on this idea of Bitcoin as a payment network.
He's the founder of a company called Strike, is it?
Strike, exactly.
Yeah, and it just basically allows for Bitcoin payments and like a nice app, right?
Especially like remittances.
Okay.
So like sort of cross-border payment. And like why is that important? It's like, well, Jesse, the writer for Ukbar, he tried to get his money out of Korea. So he'd been teaching in Korea. He had about 20K in the bank. He was trying to get that to the US. And the Korean banks were like, we can't do that. They're like, it just literally, we're not synced in. So like, we can't get it there. Here's the cash. That's your only option. And then he had to like travel. And he mentioned this story. It's really interesting. He had to travel with cash for a while. He ends up getting stopped at like the Kyrgyzstan border because they think he's Edward Snowden because he's like an American traveler with a lot of cash.
Oh, that's hilarious.
So like when we travel, I don't have to travel with cash. What did Strike do that's so interesting? They did an awesome remittance app. That's another like core tool. I would say like something that strikes me so much about Strike is like how it connects to the frontier, and it kind of draws a strong contrast with a lot of other crypto companies I see. And so with Strike, how like, do you know the story of how like I was just in El Salvador? I'm going to be living there on and off as I get kind of the hub going in El Salvador. But like, do you know why the El Salvadorian government legalized Bitcoin? It's kind of fascinating, or like how it organically happened.
Please tell it.
Okay, so it's kind of interesting. It's like basically there was this guy, Mike, I forget his last name, but he was a surfer from San Diego with a family of 3, evangelical Christian, sort of a missionary type, a real Christian basically. And he went down, he moved his entire family to El Zonte, which is now called Bitcoin Beach. And he was just hanging out there doing sort of missionary work, doing like just like fun stuff like teaching kids in the town how to surf, just like living in the community, being a normal human. And he was also really into Bitcoin. Like he was an early Bitcoin guy. And then one of his friends visited, who was even like much richer than him, visited El Zonte and was like, I love what you're doing here. Can I help scale it? Like I have a lot of money now because Bitcoin's pumping, and like because it's after the 2017 massive run up. And so they give him $100,000 worth of Bitcoin with the condition that he not exchange it into dollars. So he has to pay people in Bitcoin. So he's already doing these sort of community projects. And so Mike just like has 100K now, and he just like goes out. He's like, all right, I need to like spread this. Who wants it? It's only teenagers who want it. And so like to clean up the El Zonte beach, he gives them Bitcoin because they're like, oh, this is cool. Like they kind of get it as like, this is the future money. Whereas the old people, when I talk to them in El Salvador, they're like, this is fake internet magic money. This isn't real. Like it's not physical. That's a separate thing we could go down to, like the physical versus digital, because it's so fascinating to me. But on the frontier, this kind of topic of the frontier, he did the 100K, and then one of his friends visited, and Jack Mahler's was trying to figure out where to launch Strike. So he had the product pretty well built. He wasn't getting interest in the US that much, because frankly, like Americans have bank accounts, whereas El Salvadorians in most of the developing world do not have bank accounts. Only 30% of El Salvadorians have bank accounts. And so Mike and another dude, I think his name's Peter, they're in the McCormick podcast. It's a really good episode on that if you need more information. But basically, they invite Jack down to like do like a boots on the ground project. So Jack goes out to the frontier and he starts playing with it, and then he decides like, this is incredible. He spends a few months in El Salvador, loves the country. He's like, I'm going to launch my app here and not in the US, not some other market. And so he launches Strike in El Salvador, and it becomes like one of the most downloaded apps in El Salvador. People love it because it's a slick app. It helps them do remittance payments. It also helps them, have a bank account on their phone. Basically what he's doing is using Bitcoin as a payment network in that it settles every 10 minutes, which is unique to Bitcoin. Fiat does not settle. It takes like 6 months to settle fiat. So it settles in 10 minutes, and then you can just basically convert it into stable coins. So you basically don't have like currency holding risk.
Right.
You know, like you're not subject to
How long until you think something like that is built with the Bitcoin wallet on Urbit?
Yeah, I mean, we're still waiting on the Lightning wallet
Right.
on Urbit, although Tondas, I think, is going to be taking that over, I heard.
I feel like that should come sooner than later, right? Because, I mean, it's pretty simple, right? I mean,
Yeah, I don't think it's actually that hard. Urbit has had this, like, sort of last, like, we put out grants, but then, like, usually people don't actually get them to, like, all the way there. And so I'm more like, that's sort of a side conversation on, like, Urbit's sort of issues with, like, its whole apprenticeship grant model.
Well, it's easy for me to say it's simple, right? What the fuck am I going to do? But
yeah, but it actually is relatively simple.
Right, you would think.
Which is interesting.
It's something I expect, certainly.
And I was promised it last July.
Oh, you were?
Content. Yeah. Like, Tim promised me it, like, we've got this grant going last July.
Okay, well, good to know people are thinking about it, at least. I'm sure it'll come.
Yeah, so Tondas, Jake, guy who expats, great guy. He was a Solidity dev, but he's a huge maxi. We got into like a 2-hour argument about ETH versus Bitcoin, where we realized we mostly agreed. But he's like all in on Bitcoin and wants to do a lot more development because he's worked in DeFi and he wants to bring a lot of that DeFi knowledge from ETH into Bitcoin. So I'm super bullish on like Jake working more on it.
Nice. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean,
so
just being able to move crypto easily and reliably and securely across Urbits in a way that's like smooth and easy will be a game changer.
It'll be awesome.
Yeah,
like imagine you have like a podcast or a blog and it's just streaming money.
For people who are not in the loop, there is already a Bitcoin wallet on Urbit, but it just needs some improvements. It's not like super widely used. Yeah. So getting back to this topic of the frontier. What other kind of lessons are you drawing from these observations? I know that you have done some studying on the frontier. I know a lot of people in the Urbit verse have learned a lot from the Pilgrims, for instance. What did you learn from William Bradford's writings?
Yeah, it's funny. Like I grew up in Boston, so like I've heard of like the Plymouth plantation. Like they do tours there now, and like and we always talk about how Boston's a Puritan place, but it's really interesting. Bitmap and Lumder, I think is his Pat P.
Yeah.
Trent. Will and Trent.
Yeah.
They were like talking about this book in El Salvador. They're like, oh, we're reading it on the flight down to El Salvador. Nice. They're like, this book is awesome. It's called Of Plymouth Foundation. It's William Bradford's diary from like 1610 to like I think 1630-ish, so about 20 years. And it covers a really interesting period that I can kind of talk about. But the main thing about it also includes like letters. He's like, hey, don't just like trust my diary. Here's like all of my correspondence with like leaders of the church who are moving people. And like a lot of my insights from it was like one of those books that was just like foundational to my understanding of projects. And like one thing was just like they moved, they were actually persecuted in England, so they had to move to the Netherlands. And then it was basically like, why did they leave the Netherlands? It was fine for them now, but they realized they weren't going to have control over kind of like their kids' education and future and the culture. So they knew that their kids are basically going to assimilate into the Dutch society instead of their Puritan society. And it's sort of interesting because like a lot of people fled to Austin, right? This is sort of like the Netherlands in some parts of this analogy, but you don't really control the Austin culture. You don't really control how your kids grow up. And so William Bradford realized that, the leaders of the church realized it, and they said, we have to get to we need to go somewhere. They were looking at South America, Virginia, and Boston. And they ended up picking, south of Boston. And another of like the huge insights is just like, being out on the frontier, it's like heavily marketing. Like they were constantly had a bad reputation, the Puritans did, their plantation did back in London. So they were constantly fighting this disinformation. There was even a spy sent from enemy bankers who edited their letters on a boat. So the spy went out to a boat, edited their letters to make them look bad, and they only had like barely discovered the plot and then re-edited the letters. So
wait, and why did they care about marketing? Because they wanted to attract new people to come.
They needed more settlers and they needed supplies and money. It's like kind of, and that's, we can talk a little bit about that. I would say like, already the frontier exists and we're kind of at a similar point where like the plantation is there, but it's like, it's not struggling, it's like winning, but it could win faster in terms of like people and resources through like good sort of understanding of what it's trying to achieve. And so he did just a ton of work in terms of making that plantation successful so that there was, they could attract more capital and people.
And what were his main realizations or practices that allowed him to win?
Yeah, one of the most interesting actually is they started communist. The first year is like literally was shared land and you had to all work it.
Right, that was very much like the early Christian church. Yeah.
Yeah, and so it was shared land, very explicitly communist.
Right.
And then like they lost 50% of their community to starvation.
Wow.
In the first 6 months that first winter, and then they had a shitty harvest that with using this communist approach to agriculture in their first season, because they had bad timing. They landed in November. It's very cold. By November, you can't plant. So that first harvest was raised on communist methods, and they were still hungry. And everyone who visited was like, wait, everyone's still hungry like a year in? And then he's like, oh, we moved to like capitalist practices where like everyone has their own land and can like work their own plot and make money for working someone else's plot. And he's like, we literally never had hunger issues again. That's like the key phrase is like,
oh wow,
communism doesn't work. And so you have to like, and I actually kind of think about that when I think about these kind of like the praxis model, for example, we can kind of dig into a little, but these kind of like broad, like huge projects that are trying to get a ton of money and people to do something at once. It's like somewhat communist. And whereas I think the hub and spoke model that we're using with Aleph, it allows you to have the hub, just as we have this hub in Austin. But then, the spokes are like, that event space we went to last night. It's like the Commodore restaurant that Will owns. It's like these core spokes that make the hub more useful, but they're independently operated. No one's telling that guy, like, you have to charge this for steak because it's like...
So basically, the lesson you take from the Pilgrims is that to make a new city on the frontier flourish, you have to make it kind of hyper capitalist in the sense of a large number of small projects where incentives are really well defined and strong accountability.
Yep.
And everyone is working hard for basically personal rewards. That if you kind of have everyone doing that and it's well defined, then as a collective it can grow and it can win. But if you try to be too loosey goosey and happy go lucky and everyone share and try to help each other, kumbaya, that's not going to work.
Yeah, and like I think Praxis has really good messaging on sort of, what is it, like future heroism. It's like a kind of a great term and like this sort of aesthetic of like the frontier that they've done a good job expanding upon, and like they're clearly intelligent people and I respect they raise money, but like this idea of moving 2,000 people, like waiting to have $1 billion and moving 2,000 people at once to some other location, like to me just like seems incredibly sort of like kind of like that model has been tried and failed many times. I would encourage them to do more of a model, even like what Bradford did, which is like you have your community back in Europe, you put a plantation out like a actual settlement so you get real world experience, and then you kind of benefit from the network effect where you're getting supplies, money, and people back from the home base. So, Praxis has a lot of infrastructure in New York. That's great. They have so many members. I would encourage them just to get empirical knowledge of being on the frontier.
So, right. So say more about, this is great. Say more about this. I mean, so especially in the Urbit context or in the Aleph context, like what do you do concretely? How do you take the William Bradford, intuitions and put them on crypto rails with like, contemporary 21st century economic steroids behind them?
Yeah. So it's like, Urbit's huge on that because you can basically you own your social graph and we own the communication. So we don't have to worry about someone like hacking our letters and like switching what they're saying that's going back to London. We control our own communication and we're very networked in to the home country, the USA. And so basically we don't have to rely on third parties. We have our own communication. We have our own control of our money, so we don't have to rely on the bankers that they had to rely on in London to send out the financing. We don't have to operate through third parties.
Also, it took fucking forever, right? It's months for messages to get back and forth.
Yeah, I think it was actually weirdly only like a 2-week voyage, but then you picture 2 weeks, and the guy has to wait till he has something to say in the letter. Or that it's
right. Talk about latency.
Oh yeah, that's a minimum latency of a month if he like immediately goes and comes back.
How many transactions per minute does that amount to?
Yeah, it weirdly was sufficient.
They pulled it off, right? So
yeah, so I'd say with Aleph, like we just have a really nice backend that we're building, and so regardless of whether we meet someone through, people message me after you'd posted the YouTube and they're like, hey, this sounds cool, like how do I get looped in? So that lets us loop them into the backend. But also when we also people in person who I meet. They're like, hey, this sounds really cool. Like there's this guy, Jack, who came to the meetup last night. I met him at a bar in El Salvador, and he was just a cool guy. He had been working with El Salvadorian government. And I was just like, this is a good guy. We should like loop him in. And so like we can, because we have our own networks on the back end, we can loop people in on the front end in different ways. Twitter, YouTube, it doesn't really matter in person.
Right. But I think what you were saying about the capitalist aspect and really getting aggressive with incentives and rewards and making sure that every individual agent in a system can access a certain amount of upside, right?
Yeah.
That seems to be the key idea that you're kind of drawing from the Pilgrims, which a lot of people probably wouldn't expect that to necessarily be one of the lessons you take from the Pilgrims.
Yeah, they're extremely capitalist.
Yeah, but in this world where we have all of these new tools, it does seem like you can really apply that logic in a new and more accelerated way.
Yeah, so one part of it is just like, as we talked about the hub and spoke, where like you do need to let people operate fairly independently, especially people as capable as Urbiters. You do want them operating independently to the extent possible, and not managing them too closely. On the incentive thing, I think like you do want a membership token that kind of governs it. Like we see this with the Galactic Senate, we see this with Miladies. These kind of like membership tokens are awesome for gating your communities.
You think NFTs are the model there?
Yeah, I think so far.
So like a discrete set of individual tokens.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah, I think like it's kind of like we've seen this with galaxies. Like it's really good to have kind of like one person own a galaxy. It accrues value as the network. That membership token accrues value as basically being a member of it goes up, and the prestige of being a member. So being, the bull case for galaxies is basically people are going to like want to be connected to the Galactic Senate, maybe for voting reasons, but probably more for status reasons, like how Pax is wearing his galaxy number on his jersey at a meetup. It's just cool. Like, they're short, they're memorable.
Sure. Yeah.
So membership NFTs are like definitely one angle. I also like
the idea that model's here to stay. That's not a fad. That's
definitely not a fad. Okay. We already did this organically. Like the Freemasons had membership rosters. Just having an NFT associated with it reduces a lot of the bureaucratic burden. A lot of what crypto is doing is like making things easier. Like with the Airbnb example, if they had done tokens, they wouldn't have to study 200 securities laws and like create equity that's customized to every single jurisdiction they operate out of.
Right. They could just break the securities laws of 200 countries in one fell swoop.
Yeah, we could talk about the legal aspects too. It's a really fascinating. My dad, he worked both in the Reagan Justice Department as like assistant director on policy, but then he also worked as assistant general counsel. So as I mentioned, he did tech IPOs, then he got into crypto law. And so I've learned just a tremendous amount from like hearing his opinion on crypto law, and he's a lawyer for a lot of the Urbit guys. Can't say names, but basically, crypto law is fascinating. There are a lot of it's like an area where like basically if you're issuing a token, talk to a lawyer.
Yeah.
It's like the kind of like, too long didn't read.
Right.
But there are strategies there are ways lawyers can actually help you in this current environment. There's ways you can structure your businesses where you're actually not breaking anyone's laws. Or another way I think of it is like, okay, whose laws am I breaking? If I'm breaking like the Central African Republic's laws, do I care? Can they get me?
Right.
The IRS can 100% get you. So I take the IRS very seriously, and I respect their authority, in the words of Cartman. And so, so I definitely like think about jurisdictions that like, that's actually a good point on like states, right? Like not all states are created equal. Some states are the nuclear powers, right? And they have a lot of power. Like Russia is threatening literally like on their own, like their State Department is threatening to nuke people if they don't get their way. And like, and if nuclear power has ever been invaded. So there's different classes of states. And then there's also like states that can hit you, and there's states that can't as sort of a sovereign individual.
So what are the particular structures you've found are the best practices, or what you think will emerge as the best practices when it comes to, in my audience, we have a lot of engineers, but also creators, writers, people who are trying to be avant-garde when it comes to crypto and really get out in front of all of that kind of stuff. From what you know and the experiences you've had around the world, but also maybe within your family, you have a lot of interesting things going on. Like what kind of advice do you have, or what are the top practices that people should know about?
Yeah, good question. I would say to start off, it's important to think like the SEC thinks, and like the SEC is very clearly, both the U.S. Treasury and the SEC are just trying to like make this go slower, crypto. Just like it's going to happen anyway. They can't stop it, but they want it to proceed slower. And so how do you do that? You just keep everything ambiguous, and then you occasionally do these like insanely strict enforcement actions against some individuals. Like we just saw them hit, the first DAO is getting hit by the SEC. It's the Coinbase example where they're hitting them not just on insider trading, which is a criminal felony. They're also hitting them on wire fraud. So that's like wire fraud. Okay, so these are like big things. These are serious. This is sort of how they hit Ross Ulbricht, the head of Silk Road. Like they like got him on like attempted murder somehow, like on basically no evidence, and so now he's in jail with no possibility of parole. So that's like unfortunate. So you have to think, they like making examples of people. They're way beyond what the laws actually say. Like the actual laws haven't been updated since like the 30s on this. There have been a couple Supreme Court cases. We mostly look at the Howey test, right? I'm not going to do a complete like explainer on the Howey test right now. I did a podcast.
We've actually talked about it on this podcast a
awesome.
few times. Yeah,
so people might know the Howey test.
Because I'm playing around with a lot of this stuff. I'm definitely trying to be at the cutting edge. I do think that from the creator perspective, whether you're a writer or a YouTuber or podcaster or whatever, I do basically believe that crypto is a really important kind of revolutionary moment for all of this stuff. My position over the past year or two, really, as it's become more and more a theme on the podcast, is really just that I see it as, from a research perspective, I'm thinking about it. I'm just watching. I'm playing around with things, but
you're
I'm
kind of on
going
the cutting
slow.
edge of applying a lot of this.
Exactly. Well, I'm just going slow and playing around with things, and that's kind of been the ethics of this podcast, and for the people in my audience is, we're trying to understand these things, so we can be out in front of them.
Yeah, so kind of an insight into how the SEC thinking is like they want more enforcement discretion with the end goal of like making crypto proceed slower, like slowing the rate of adoption. A lot of the thing with the Howey test, actually, I guess we will go into it, is like this word soul. So like, are you benefiting from the soul action of others? And SEC doesn't like the word soul because it's very constrictive to the SEC. And so the Supreme Court said it, and the Supreme Court hasn't changed that since the Howey test, which was a long time ago, that SEC versus Howey, I think it was the case. And so they want to expand beyond soul. They want to be able to like enforce broadly across crypto.
Right.
But they're beyond what is legally justified. And so they have to hit weak projects. They have to hit weak individuals. So with the ICO enforcement actions, they hit like the obvious scams first, because that helps give them sort of like a reputation in the press. It's like SEC won this case, won that case. It also helps them with the courts, because you have lower courts saying, yep, okay, you can hit ICOs. You have like jurisdiction over that. So now they're doing the exact same thing on DAOs. So yeah, I would say.
Do you think NFTs are safer? This is something a lot of people seem to think, is that like NFTs seem to be legally safer than the fungible tokens in general.
Yeah, I can't comment on it that much. I did come up in my interview with my dad on it, and yeah, it was safer. I'm trying to think the exact reason. I think it was related to like, it's sort of like selling art.
Right.
And art isn't under the purview of the SEC, fortunately.
It's more like a collectible, and
exactly.
It feels less like a security.
It's sort of like with Bitcoin, how it's now regulated as a commodity and not as a security. Right. It changes who gets to regulate it and how.
Right. So you've done a lot of research on different countries. You've been roaming around, and for Aleph, you're looking into what are the best places to do things. You're just generally well informed about this, and you've been paying close attention to this. So for people listening or watching who are, like us, super into crypto, have a lot of their net worth in crypto, and are trying to stay, sophisticated and flexible with respect to all the different global crises we could expect in the next few years, what in your research has shown to be some of the best places that people should be aware of? Like, are there 2 or 3 standout places where if you had to put your money on it, like this is where the new crypto economy, this is going to be, if this shit hits the fan in the US, this is where you should move with your family. Like, what are you finding?
Yeah, so I think one core thing is like, what do I want from the country?
Okay.
Usually what I want is like visas or like the ability to live pretty much indefinitely on a tourist visa if they're not going to give me residency visa.
Okay.
So I'm a resident of Ukraine and Mexico. I have long-term residency there in both countries.
How long is long-term residency?
Just 3 years currently, but with Mexico.
But you can like re-up that whenever?
Mexico, it re-ups after 3 years to an automatic green card for life, which is one of the best programs that exists.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Ukraine's, you have to hire yourself again and play along, but it's pretty easy in Ukraine.
I see. Okay.
Of course, Ukraine's one's not that useful to me now. So, like, first off is like, okay, do you want to live there? If you want to live there, you need to be able to live there legally. So that means you need, you know, like a digital nomad visa. There's so many of them, as I mentioned earlier, or like you go residency route. If you're rich, you can basically do residency almost anywhere. Actually, even if you're not rich, like Portugal has such a good digital nomad visa, and that gives you EU-wide access for 2 years for like almost nothing. So like actually most of the countries in the world are open at the visa level. Then we dig into the next one. What do you want? You kind of want like not bad tax treatment. So ideally your foreign income, right? If you're working in like crypto business, ideally it's not taxed.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of countries provide that like exemption from taxation if it's foreign sourced income versus domestic.
Okay.
So you're not working at like, you know, you're not running a local factory that's obviously domestic income.
Right.
So taxation's big.
So you showed a table last night in your presentation though of a few different countries with the different.
Yeah.
So if you when you rank order them all with some
Yeah,
kind
across
of
everything,
a weighted function of all of these things, what in your analysis shakes out as the best? Or
Lisbon's awesome for like what I call phase 1 and 2, which is like you don't necessarily want to buy the stuff if you just want to like lease and create hubs, and you can do a lot off of leasing stuff. And you want visas. It has no capital gains. It has a great crypto scene in Lisbon. Even Porto is a beautiful city. So Portugal is awesome. Mexico is great because of Mexico City, basically, and has awesome beaches. So again, very friendly. Visa laws, very friendly, like the most friendly visa laws, basically.
Yeah.
They'll even give you like citizenship, and it's a great passport. And then El Salvador, because you can like, another big thing, actually, the third thing in addition to like taxation visas is like off ramps from crypto. Because as you mentioned, your audience is crypto. My brother was living, there was just, well, I'll just, speak generally. There were great off ramps in Ukraine. Ukraine, you could convert Bitcoin into cash very easily. So that means like no KYC. Not many other places have that. El Salvador has that at low levels. You can do $1,000 a day, no KYC, no fee if you're an El Salvadorian citizen, or you can just get an El Salvadorian to do that trade for you. So El Salvador has off ramps. I love El Salvador in terms of this sort of like bigger thing of like getting to build the future you want. It's sort of like an empty frontier where you really get to like work with what's there, whereas like it's sort of different from moving to like Mexico City or Lisbon, where it's like sort of a frontier town. There's sort of frontier stuff happening.
I want to ask you about El Salvador because you mentioned it before, and I think a lot of people who listen to this podcast probably have heard about, oh yeah, El Salvador is doing a lot of Bitcoin stuff. But you've been down there, you've looked into it a lot. It seems like you know a lot about it. Like, is this really important and like really cool and crazy awesome, or is it like maybe we'll wait and see, maybe it's nothing? Because I feel like having no personal experience with it from afar, I'm kind of, my mind I'm finding is biased and thinking kind of like writing it off like this is probably just publicity. Maybe it'll turn into something, maybe it won't. But I kind of get the vibe from you that like it's super real. Like, is this super exciting and super important?
Yeah, it is critical. Like, it's actually hard to overemphasize that. Like
you're super bullish on El Salvador.
Basically, yeah, in some ways, like El Salvador is Plymouth Plantation. And if it wins, we get America, and if it loses, we don't.
And you feel confident that this is like already happening. It's almost a foregone conclusion, or like do you have uncertainty or skepticism, or like
in El Salvador, or globally,
specifically El Salvador. Like, because I'm just curious. Like, are you basically saying like, no, this is happening and it's really crazy and cool, or maybe it will?
Yeah, no, El Salvador is awesome. It already happened. You know, it has a horrific reputation in the U.S. and globally because it was the most dangerous country in Latin America for ages and even in the world. Now it's currently ranked best on safety in Latin America in the last 3 months. They arrested most of the gang members, and unlike Mexico, like the gangs don't have ammo, so like it's actually pretty easy to beat them.
So you think El Salvador has a really good, legit chance of like blowing up, becoming like a super?
It's gonna blow up as a tourist destination, even regardless of crypto. It's so important for all of us that El Salvador wins because that's what creates all the copycats. If El Salvador wins and everyone's like, whoa, like if if all like Panama looks at El Salvador and they're like, whoa, they just like developed so quickly. Like last year they had 10% GDP growth in El Salvador. When people see that and like the tourism numbers coming out of El Salvador are ridiculous. It's like a 30% boost to tourism and there's not even that many tourists there. So it's basically like, if that wins, then we get the crypto future we want. And so like people should really be taking their vacations to El Salvador because A, it's beautiful, safe, and awesome, and has great roads and beaches. And it's very convenient. There's tons of crypto meetups. There's no KYC. You can buy coffee using Lightning. You can buy pupusas. The food's awesome.
And people actually do that a lot, like buy stuff with Lightning. It's
like yeah,
literally common. You see
literally
people
my card.
It.
Yeah. All of Surf City like accepts Lightning.
And I mean, how many people are in Bitcoin Beach, like roughly, like actually doing this stuff?
So the meetups are actually really well attended. So like Bitcoin Beach is like a little bit, basically, I think there's like a couple hundred expats living there now. So they get together at sunset. The sun sets over the Pacific. It's a beautiful beach. So it's just sort of like a Bitcoin retirement home almost.
Okay.
But there's a lot more activity happening in the city in those meetups where like there's a lot of El Salvadorians using Bitcoin as part of their business. And so the El Salvadorians are very eager to work. I've been just like incredibly impressed with El Salvadorians as humans and as like as people to work with.
Okay, so you're super bullish on El Salvador. You'd say
it has great human capital.
Sounds like you think that's one of the top spots in addition to Portugal.
Yeah, it has a better time zone too. So like Portugal is 5 hours east, which isn't terrible, but that's about as far east as you want to go. Like 6 hours is kind of the limit.
You mean like for working with
Americans?
Americans?
Working with Americans.
Right.
I mean, it's nice when you're that direction. So I basically rule out Asia because you'd have to wake up at like odd hours. Whereas like at least when I worked out of Ukraine, at least I could get a good day in, and then I had to stay up a little bit later, but it wasn't a big deal. I like got off work at midnight.
So any other standout places when you do your like full multi-dimensional analysis?
Yeah, Ukraine was awesome. I think it will be awesome again. Obviously that's on a hold period. Medellin is really awesome. It has a lot of crypto activity. It's sort of like a Mexico City where it's like the whole country isn't awesome, but the city itself is awesome for living and for crypto. And I would say it's actually mostly happening in Latin America, Europe. You can do a lot without the place being perfect. Like my brother just lives out of Italy, and so like because he's not taxed by Italy's laws anyway. So I've been highlighting the places that have sort of like a lot of people going there, because like a lot of these people probably want to like network.
Right.
If you have a family and you're just trying to live from a beautiful place, like Europe is all open to you right now. So you can just do Europe pretty easily.
But you don't get any particular advantages, like in terms of,
No, and you might have capital gains
right.
in that jurisdiction.
Right. Now, what about for Americans who are citizens, live in America, kind of normie Americans, especially normies like me with families and, whatever, trying to kind of build a family in America?
Yeah.
Are there things that people should be doing that they don't know about? Like, like should you go to El Salvador just to kind of like file your new business or something like that? And like,
I think setting up shell companies out of El Salvador makes total sense.
Yeah.
Even setting up companies that aren't shell, because like the labor costs are so ridiculously low there, and the English levels are actually really high, like fluent. Like weirdly, a lot of El Salvadorians work for U.S. companies and outsource jobs. Okay. So like English levels are higher there than anywhere else in Latin America. It's like bordering like Europe. So like, you could just outsource a lot of things, like a personal assistant's like, $500 a month there. So you just have someone do a lot of your administration.
And is the culture and economy enough, like developed enough that it's like easy and functional to do these things? Like, so you could go.
It's high-speed internet. It has a lot of co-working spaces.
So if you go to El Salvador and you want to, file for a business there and you want to build a little thing there, it's like things will actually move, and it's not like, because a lot of countries like that. I haven't traveled in South America myself actually at all, so totally ignorant. But I know enough about the world that I do know that in a lot of countries things just often don't work very well, and so that's in terms of bureaucracies and everything. So it sounds like El Salvador really is, from your perspective, it's like really functional and working well.
Yeah, they set up a new track, basically. The new president, who has made it the safest place in Latin America, built American level highways. Like the highways are so good, it's insane.
Wow.
It's better than the Northeast for sure of the U.S. And then basically, yeah, they set up a track to like basically have a streamlined process for setting up businesses that reports directly to the president's brother instead of through the normal bureaucracy, which has the exact issues that you're commenting on. Normal bureaucracies are terrible. I mean, they suck in the U.S. too. For context, like,
yeah, terrible.
It's not fun in the U.S. either.
No,
But yeah, they've basically set up this like separate red carpet type experience to attract investment. Where you get to interact with like intelligent people who are motivated for results versus it's very patchworky actually.
Right. I guess I'm just trying to gauge like, is this really only for kind of like international financial whale types, or
no,
is it, you think
I'm
this
even
is actually
encouraging,
like this is relevant to people,
I think
even
it's
like small
relevant
small
to
business
you.
people?
Like, I think it's relevant
yeah.
to small business people who have token use cases for monetizing their networks to improve the network. So yeah, my dad's been opening several businesses, so he's sort of pioneering the process of opening American businesses in El Salvador.
Oh, really?
Currently has 10 slated, so like I'll be able to give you like
10?
the hard. Yeah.
Okay.
And there's like a lot more in the works. So like, yeah, Americans want to locate to El Salvador. So like, don't tell me what you think. Show me what you're doing. Like, yeah, we're opening businesses.
How does
in
your
El
dad
Salvador.
run 10 companies, or just
He doesn't run.
He's doing it for others.
Yeah,
Yes,
he's a
got it.
lawyer. He's a lawyer.
Oh, right, of course.
He's
okay.
even helping like. Well, I don't want to speak too much, but like, there's people in Austin who personally who are setting up in El Salvador. So I'm happy to connect you with them.
Well, I feel like we covered a lot of ground. I feel like maybe my final question, and of course we can get on anything else you want to add to the agenda, but my final question would be about your vision for the phases. I think it'd be nice for you to kind of spell that out. You referred to it before, but
yeah,
what are the 3 phases in this kind of generalization of the network age? Just tell us what are the tasks that occur at those three phases, and kind of paint that picture for us.
Yeah, I think of what like phase 1 is like vacationing. I think of phase 2 is sort of like leasing, and I think of phase 3 is buying, and phase 4 is like governing.
Okay.
Those are kind of like the way you can think about each of the phases.
And you and your mates are kind of at like 2.
We just are entering 2 now. We like
you're
kind of outgrew.
You're starting to lease places.
Yeah.
And you're basically kind of building a portfolio of leases, like multiple places, and you can bounce around them as friends.
And then like part of the membership is like you don't have to get stuck in one place. Like maybe you spend 3 months in one area, 3 months in another. Like
right, so like 10 people can share 3 leases in 3 different countries.
Yep.
And you just bounce around when you feel like it.
Yeah, that's kind of, ideally it would be like 20 countries down the road.
And is this formalized at all? Are you a company? Is that a company doing it, or what is the structure you're doing that with?
Currently it's been bootstrapped, and like weirdly, like that's another tool of crypto is you can just throw money into a multi-sig. So like,
and is that what this project is like?
That's our next step in this project. So
okay.
we basically did phase 1. Which was like me living abroad for 2 years, a bunch of other guys getting looped in, and we just pick up people like Talon offsites.
And that's just totally informal, basically.
It was like totally informal, no company, no like real structure. And then we're like, oh, okay, like there's something here. We've sort of like identified this sort of people market fit, I almost would say, where, yeah, there's like a ton of demand for help in this lifestyle. Right. And there's a ton of demand to have an actual network. So it's not just I live in San Salvador or Bitcoin Beach. It's like, oh, I can like network in Lisbon, El Salvador, and Mexico City, 3 very different places. And so like, and Selena did this really well too. They actually have they have a model where like you can rent out of any set of places.
Okay.
So those are the 4 phases. I want to talk a little bit more about phase 2 is like, it's leasing the hub. So you actually have a hub like you have in Austin where people can go hang out and have consistency and hang out, and where also if you're thinking of coming to El Salvador and just checking out on vacation, you can be like, there will be people here.
So the Aleph hub will be El Salvador?
Yeah.
That's like the main kind of HQ at
the
start.
Second, it's Mexico City and El Salvador almost in tandem. Mexico City a couple months later.
And is this so? Are you gonna have like a multi-sig that kind of owns the lease, or how do you structure that?
Yeah, I mean for this one, that's like the future state that I want to get to. Or like the current state is like I have to deal with the landlady.
Right. So just do it the normal way.
So I do it the normal way, but we handle like we can do the multi-sig for like collecting rent.
Okay.
There's some amount even in crypto of usefulness for basically off-ramp these bridges back to the old world. Like that's what like someone who's doing OTC of a lot of crypto is doing for you. They're like giving you access to basically their fiat money.
Right.
And so they're creating a bridge between fiat and crypto.
Right.
And so some of what Aleph is doing is creating those bridges for you so that, for example, you could live your life just with crypto and you don't have to like have bank accounts anymore. You can pay in crypto and we'll do the process of converting it. because I think that's like what future people really want.
Okay, so phase 2 is basically leasing like an HQ in the main place.
Yep.
The hub, if you will.
Exactly.
And so then phase 3.
Phase 3 is like, it's almost more like what William Bitmap is doing here in Austin, where it's like, you know, he thought of it as like, he bought a bar, and then he bought a restaurant, and then he bought a hotel. And so like he's sort of doing each of these, and it's kind of like, why would you spend, like, what's the real use case for spending, like, why are we not just stacking sats? Like, why spend capital on physical? It's like, well, you get to control the experience. And so if you're trying to shape culture in the way you want it, you kind of have to invest in creating the spaces aesthetically that bring out that in people.
Right.
Like, it's sort of like, if you want, it's like what the Medicis did. They invested, you know, in Michelangelo and a lot of other artists. And like, they're like, hey, we want a certain type of art. You actually have to invest in that.
Right.
And so it's like, yeah, we want to own digital and rent physical to the extent possible. But there are certain things where you do need to start owning physical, because it just allows you to create the exact culture you want, instead of having to kind of basically stitch a few different spaces together. Like,
right.
You could, for example, partner with a WeWorking space. Like, there's one that's doing a Bitcoin space in El Salvador.
But then you're subject to all their like gay
weird
shit.
Bitcoin. Yeah, like, honestly, like, actually, quite frankly, you know, like, now it's like, are you doing Urbit? Is that like some scam? It's like,
right.
No, like, so that's honestly, like, it's a little bit of a tangent from
like,
this.
no, motherfuckers, we're gonna buy you and you're done.
Exactly. And like, I don't know, like, weirdly, like, ETH and Bitcoin have this like builders mentality. They attract builders. Bitcoin is weirdly like, the maximalists are basically like this landed aristocracy that just like wants to collect rent on having been early to Bitcoin. Like, they're not really building. I think that's kind of fucked up. And I think like, you really as a project should be structuring your incentives such that like, you're actually rewarding people for building like new infrastructure on it. And like, you know, ETH does a decent job of that, I would say. It at least has a full blown out economy with DeFi where you can, like, Uniswap figured out ways to earn ETH by building an awesome product. I think Urbit would accelerate faster if it did a better job of, you know, rewarding address space to people who are doing good work. Like, Urbit Live has done like insanely large amounts of work, and I'm not sure if they like, you know, like, they don't own much of the address space. And so Urbit actually has this issue, frankly. It has sort of a Bitcoin type issue where the address space is insanely concentrated. There's so many apps we want built today. It's just moving at a glacial pace in a lot of ways, because I'd say it hasn't learned the lessons of ETH, where it's sort of like set it and forget it, like set the incentives properly, and then you get a Uniswap, you get DeFi, you get NFT markets. Right. And it's doing kind of like, honestly, more of the communist type thing of like centrally managed.
I feel like it's changing now, though. Like right now, as we speak.
It's moving, and I'm very bullish on Urbit. No, don't get me wrong. And it is changing as a culture, and I see it happening day by day. But I kind of think a lot about, why are we not getting that ETH type thing?
No, I mean, honestly, like, I say this on the podcast to people listening and watching, like, letting them, like, I scream from the rooftops now, like, there is capital, there's money, like, there's a lot of money floating around, and if you're into Urbit, if you fuck with it, like, and you want to build shit, just fucking send me an email. There's money.
There's money,
for
there's
people
mentors.
Yeah. So it's like,
and I think, didn't you kind of like organically, you said you would like maybe like even put together like a little bit of like an investor club, or almost like,
I have a little syndicate. I have a little syndicate
okay.
on Urbit. We just bought a bunch of Miladies. And some other things, you know, some Urbit adjacent things, you know. So that was mostly just for fun, but it's more like, you know, I think more about just engineers, but also creators, just people who are basically looking for something better and bigger from the internet. You know, this problem that you're talking about unlocking incentives and making a lot of people feel like it's worth it for them to work on it. You know, I totally understand what you're saying, and it's one thing for us to talk about this, you know, almost like as third-party bystanders. But on the other hand, like, there are people listening to this who we need to tell them, like, no, get involved. There's money. Like, we're figuring it out. But, like, if you can add value, there's money slushing around. Just, you know, get in the mix, put in the legwork of just trying to get the ball rolling. But and basically what I have found in Urbit world is, if you have high agency and you just like get after some things, you're going to quickly find people with resources who want to support you. And everyone that I've encountered in the Urbit world, like, has a very positive sum attitude of just like, you know, wanting to make sure everything is fair and wanting to make sure that if you're creating value, you're going to get some in return.
Yeah.
Like I've never, struggled to eventually find that, because as someone who's like,
trust, it's like it doesn't ever have a culture of like short-term screwing over someone. I think I don't think the thing I critiqued there, I don't think it's really intentional.
No, it's a common problem.
Yeah, it's a common problem, and I don't think it's intentional. It's just the way it has been a little bit. But you're totally right. You can bootstrap a lot of this.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is I want to talk actually very slightly about this idea of internal economy, because it was sort of clicking with a few people yesterday at the meetup, and it's really interesting in the context of this.
Sure, yeah.
It's basically Urbit more or less has an internal economy and an internal culture, and that's so incredibly valuable to Urbit as a project.
Right. People do everything from within. You don't even need to get outsiders. It's like this thing where you can source almost everything you need from within the world.
Yep.
It's good and bad in a way. Yeah.
Entrepreneur. Actually, we kind of struggle a little on entrepreneurs, actually.
Yeah.
So we have money and dev talent. We actually struggle a little on entrepreneurs. We don't really have a great sort of brand marketing type person really spearheading yet. Of course, you're stepping in a big way on the podcasting side, really helping Urbit kind of get its voice. But we still have core entrepreneurs missing. So if you're talk to me if you have any skills.
Dude,
we kind of know the gaps, so talk to us.
I sometimes tell people it's almost every business that currently exists on the current internet, probably some version of it could be built from scratch on the same business model, but on Urbit. So it's if you're an entrepreneur or a successful founder or whatever, just trying to get involved in the next biggest, most interesting thing, it's whatever you've done successfully in the past, you could probably just do it on Urbit and be sitting on an insanely massive opportunity potentially. And it's that's what it's a whole new world.
And then Justin, me, and a lot of the other guys can link you up to which one you should build first. Should it be Instagram, Facebook, which of the things from Web 2 should be built on Urbit first? Is an interesting question.
So yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you that we're still trying to, the Urbit ecosystem is still trying to figure this out, and it's not perfectly smooth yet. In an ideal world, it's just there's a million opportunities to immediately plug in, get paid to do valuable work. It's all permissionless. It's all super smooth and perfectly straightforward. It's not there yet, but it's definitely getting there. And there's, I think, a ton of people who have the same diagnosis that you have and are now starting to figure out ways to be more fluid, more permissionless, more just throwing resources at anyone who's doing something valuable.
And it's I can complain a few of the apps I want built haven't been funded by, I don't know, the foundation or someone or Talon back in the day, but it's why don't I just create a syndicate and invest in it? What's stopping me from doing that? So I actually kind of in some ways I kind of like the friction, because it's just sort of it's really agency. Urbit's a really high agency culture.
Yeah.
It's just do it. If you see a need, don't bitch about it. Just do it. If no one's investing in your thing, just fund it.
You were saying that it has a very internal culture, meaning that a lot of what is done within the Urbit world is done by and with and for other people.
Yeah,
in the Urbit world.
Jobs aren't posted to Web 2. They come internally.
It can be internal, and that is very powerful because, well, for the obvious reason that you have all of this potential kind of at your fingertips in this cohesive culture.
It also can't really be attacked.
It can't be attacked. That's right. It's illegible. People don't even know what's going on. So in a way, when Urbit really pops, it's going to melt people's faces off because so much energy has been brewing and it's all invisible for the most part. It's
also,
incredibly invisible.
We don't really care about a Guardian hit piece on us.
Yeah.
It doesn't really matter to us. It's not Phil had Nilrun-mardux had some hit piece. It's no one's going to care.
They almost literally couldn't because it's so alien to them at this point.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually.
They could definitely send some...
Yeah, I was talking to a Guardian reporter, actually, at the Mars
so clueless,
review,
completely
and
clueless.
she's just is it a cult? They're so far, they don't even know what type of cult. They don't know how to write an article on it.
They obviously could, send some people to check things out and do their research or whatever.
For women, they could get pretty deep, too.
But journalists don't do, investigative shit anymore. So it's it's actually too hard for any of them to even know what's going on enough to write some disingenuous
they're even, at our parties sometimes, Urbit Week and, the Mars Review one, and, they just don't know how.
Anyway, I was just going to also say that the internal culture thing is good for some reasons, but it can be bad for others, meaning... it makes a lot of people sleep on how much is there, right? So it's a lot of people who read my newsletter or listen to the podcast don't even know that there's so much going on, that there are now like real startups being built on Urbit, that there's real investors waiting in the wings. There's like all this opportunity, all this potential. People unfortunately don't know about it half as much as they should, in part because it's such an internal culture. And that's like one little role I'm trying to play with my podcast, basically. It's like, because I've just been like, to me, Urbit is one of the craziest things that I've encountered in the past few years. Like how much interesting, badass, just like really crazy, fascinating, cool shit is going on. And it's like, I've never heard anyone else talk about any of this stuff like anywhere, you know, except for within these circles, right? And so that's why I'm kind of like, why it's becoming more a part of my podcast and the content and stuff is because it's like, there's just so much there. It's such an arbitrage. It's like, there's so much cool shit, so many badass people no one's ever heard of. It's like, I could probably make my podcast increasingly just about this because it's a massive arbitrage, really. And the reason I say this is not to talk about myself, but to kind of show that to other people. It's like,
it's a massive space.
It's a massive opportunity
that
like everyone is sleeping on.
Crypto as money is a huge space. Crypto as computing, sound computing is a massive opportunity. When you're talking about like rebuilding all the apps, it's like, yes, exactly. They'll be built differently, right? Because they share the same social graph, so we don't have to, you know, all this stupid logins across all. One thing I would mention though, to that point of like internal and like the downsides of it is like, actually one big downside is like people think a little bit too much like I am an Urbiter versus like I am part of the network age. I am becoming a leader in this new network age. And so they get a little bit too tribal in the bad way sometimes, where they don't always mix perfectly with others. That's being solved. Like Urbit Week was a huge step forward in that regard. I think Assembly is a pretty welcoming place. But you know, one thing I think a lot about is like sound computing, not Urbit, sound money, not Bitcoin, sound community, not just Urbit. Like we really need it to be like,
I know what you mean,
you know, inclusive of a lot of like awesome artists, a lot of like we hate most of people. Like a common theme in Urbit is like, we don't like the aesthetics of the industrial age. We want like a new renaissance. And that only happens if we're inclusive of artists and creatives. And we don't want to just talk about just computing. Like we really need to expand as to like, I see Urbit as kind of like a core nucleus, sort of a atomic group. There's this book like Cold Start that's really interesting about how Tinder launched. But you get with like Urbit this awesome starting point, but if we think of it as an end in of itself, it's sort of weak. Like there's three types of kind of like networks. There's ones that are based on events, so it's like the people who go mountain bike together and like, you know, you have like this whatever clique in Austin to like go jog the river. Those are like incredibly weak. Selena is actually based on that, so it's actually kind of a bad foundation for gating a network. The next is purpose driven, which is sort of like Bitcoin maximalism is very clearly purpose driven. Urbit as the next computing is very a purpose driven mission. They're very, very strong, but they're not very inclusive. And I sometimes hate the word inclusive, but I mean it in kind of its actual like positive sense of like, there's lots of different things we want done and we need to be inclusive of those skill sets. And then if you think about values, which is more like America as a value system. So we talk a lot about like digital America, and sort of like digital America is kind of like what's evolving. And like what we liked about America was sort of agency, frontier, freedom in a lot of ways. And so we're kind of getting that now with crypto. So
I ranted a little bit about Urbit, but I want you to bring us home just to phase 4.
Phase 4, it's a crazy one to like bring home. It's like you are almost more powerful than the state. Like you don't need to be recognized by the state.
And this is the point at which you have like multiple leases, like you and your community.
You own like the core assets in a lot of cool parts of the world. So like it's basically
so you're not just leasing, you're like buying property.
Yeah, you've already phase 3. You've been buying.
Oh, that's phase 3. Okay.
Yeah, phase 2 leasing, phase 3 buying. Phase 4 is like governing. So it's basically like, hey, El Salvador, we need this like law. Weirdly, like we are currently helping draft the DAO law for El Salvador, and so like they're not. You could be doing a phase 4 at the same time you're doing a phase 1. Like you could be vacationing in Portugal and you could be like writing DAO laws you could be helping to govern.
Okay.
But it's really like it's voice. I think you did a talk about exit and voice, and like currently we exited, but long term we want to have voice. We want to have power over the communities to build the types of futures we want. And phase 4 is more about kind of like actively building the future versus exiting to a place where you can start building it.
Okay, so I think I maybe skipped 3 then, now that I think about it. So after you have these leases, right, you and your mates, your multi-sig, whatever, your little proto-DAO, you have some leases, you jump around, you know, the world, going to different places as a community, doing some kind of purpose-driven thing. At what stage do you decide to buy property? Like what makes you do that? What's the calculus for that? When is that the right choice? When does that happen?
Even already, I'm planning this out. I've been looking at hotels to kind of do a Selena type space.
But then you lose the flexibility and the resilience of being able to run with your crypto, right? So like, how do you think that through?
I do. I just look at it as like this trade-off between like.
Oh, you were saying, yeah, you need to buy if you want to really create a custom culture.
Yeah, that, and also like definitely that, but also like, look, if I lease. For example, I do a long-term lease on this hotel. Then I had complete control of events. It's different from renting a mansion where like there's, an HOA and they kind of have some amount of control over me, and I can't just throw like a massive party.
Right.
Here you can kind of more do like a Milady rave type thing. You can do like the Praxis type thing. You have control over basically the full event schedule. You can do any type of event you want,
right.
And so that's the upside. It's like, yeah, there's a little bit of downside risk, but what's the actual downside risk? Like. Your capital is not going to like immediately disappear. Like it's not just like poof. Like we've like expropriated all of your hotel.
Right.
So one advantage is you could just do a long term.
Happen, but whatever.
It could. It's like a very low probability depending on where you pick.
Right.
That's part of why I wouldn't go to like certain African countries currently.
Right.
But like Latin America has some basic level of property rights. So it's more like, okay, the regime might change. We talked about this yesterday. Like maybe the regime changes. Maybe El Salvador stops this like awesome ascent and maybe it starts getting worse. So then your property value, now it gets valued at a different valuation. You lose like maybe, let's say like 20% is kind of what you're looking at. That's like in the scenario where the regime changes, you can assign probabilities. I mean, I did a lot of stats. Like a lot of these things are just probabilities. And it's like, yeah, someone could expropriate all your money, so probably don't set up in like Congo.
Right. Unless you bring your own private military.
Yeah.
In which case, the upside could be tremendous.
Yeah. The new Rhodesia is a pet project of a lot of us, but but for now,
Well, I mean, people will kind of look askance at that and sound, oh, that sounds sketchy. Justin's podcast, they're up to some weird shit, but. When you consider the fact that like China's moving in like crazy,
China's already moved
it's
in.
It's like this is not like a
like. Do you want this sort of like totalitarian, weird colonial thing, or do you want like tech guys that are living in your place and investing, growing local food, investing in local businesses?
Yeah, I think you could even make the argument that like hardworking, honest, good, ethical American Christian people almost have an ethical obligation to. Fight some role in the future of Africa for the good of Africa, right? Because if Americans and Westerners don't have some kind of positive role in Africa, then China's going to own all of it, and I don't think that's going to be good for African people.
Yeah, I think the gospel, right? I'm a pretty Christian guy. I would just say like the gospel is like you become a born again Christian, but you're also supposed to spread it. You're supposed to evangelize the good news because it's like basically heaven's the best place, and like why wouldn't you want more people to go there?
Yeah, we've gotten away from that.
We've really gotten away from it. Like Ethiopia was Christianized very early, like very very early. It was almost like it had the connections back to King Solomon, and then like the Christian world sent a ton of missionaries to Christianize Africa, and I think Christianity that's like a totally separate conversation. I think it's a beautiful thing. I've had personal experiences where I've seen it sort of co-opted into negative, but I would say overall, yeah, it is a great value system. I think it's a beautiful thing to be proud of. And like weirdly, the Western world, I think, has kind of lost its mojo because it's not proud of its roots. The Western world is a Christian world. We like renounced Christianity and we renounced our culture in the same process.
In any event, this is like phase 4 stuff, right? Like phase 4
phase 4.
There's going to be stuff like this where
or definitely phase 3. Yeah. Phase 4, like, honestly, you've like won so much if you do phase 3 well that like I think a lot of people will be so happy with like a successful phase 3 that they might even forget there's a phase 4.
And right, so phase 3 being basically you and your community own a bunch of property distributed around the world. That's very much the Balaji's mental model in many ways, right? But then what happens from there, like after that's achieved, is where things get really interesting, and who knows what the future holds, because you can imagine situations where like imagine a future where Ukbar and Urbit take over the world, right? And so it's like you could imagine having a kind of a network state with a GDP of the size of the U.S. A is GDP, right? But it's all shrouded behind like zero knowledge stuff. It's like pseudonymous Urbit identities.
That'll probably happen. And it's more a matter of like who than like if.
Yeah,
or when.
Exactly. I mean, I think it will. Like that. This is the future I'm envisioning. And it's like if you take seriously things like zero knowledge advancements and strict pseudonymity and those types of things that Urbit, Uqbar are already going in that direction. You do have to imagine that at a certain level of development, it's like you have $1 trillion network state economies that current nation states can't even see into.
Yeah, they can't see into, and like the interesting thing is we can see into them. So we can see into their power. We know how they work. We know how to basically deal with each of them
and jump
but
around.
They have
from
no
one
idea
to the
how
other,
our
right?
network works.
Right.
And that's like
exactly.
what you actually want. It's more than I don't want to be recognized. I want to recognize their power and their structure.
Right.
I don't want them seeing I don't want to like make my power structure clear to like some random country that might be trying to screw over my network.
Right. It's like you can imagine. So the United States gets smart about the network states that are getting built in their domain. And imagine like it's 2060, right? The U.S. government is trying to crack down on these massive network states.
2040.
2040. There you go. Even sooner. And the United States government starts to pass a bill to like crack down on these network states. It's like while that bill is halfway through the Senate, you and your mates have like already relocated the shell companies. And, it's like what I mean?
Sovereign Individual like explicitly talked about the exact thing with cyber money. It was like literally by the time they're done debating in their slow way, like all of the funds have moved to a new domicile.
Right.
And like we've already seen this play out. This isn't even 2040. Like this already happened with Ukraine. This already happened with like a lot of the Argentinian wealth. And like this is accelerating massively. And like I think even in 1 year we're gonna see crazy things happen in the world because because of these trends, and also because like the industrial world. Teal talked about this recently, but the industrial world is basically we lived too far into the 20th century. It lived an extra 20 years than it should have. Like we basically didn't change in YK2 in that period. We like continued working out of these giant offices and not going remote and not doing business without borders. And so Teal was totally right about that. But now we're in kind of a new age, and like I could basically talk about this for a few days straight. So I'll kind of leave it to you how to finish.
We covered a ton of ground. That was perfect. I think we brought it home with phase 4. Where can people find you if they want to connect or learn more?
So Nilrun-mardux, also philip.galebach@gmail.com, 1L.
I'll put all this info in the show notes so you can hit up Phil.
Yeah, feel free to like email me. I'm mostly on Urbit, but I have like Telegram, WhatsApp, and Signal, so I'm also happy to communicate over those. I'd say like getting involved. I would just say, for more information, a little plug on Tim Luck, the CEO of Uqbar, my oldest brother. We're going to be doing a podcast focused just on Cyber Age.
Oh yeah, of course. I started listening to that. I listened to like the first 2 episodes. Oh, it's a separate one, not Web Zero.
Yeah, so we're actually rebranding it from Web Zero. Web Zero will be like the tech part of it.
That's what it's currently called. I listened to the first 2 episodes. It was great.
Yeah, they're great.
But you're changing the name, or it's just gonna be
we're changing the name to Network Age.
Oh, okay.
And focusing it more on kind of what we just talked about over the last like almost 2 hours, because there's so much on culture, tech, politics, law to go into, and it's just going to be kind of fun discussions like this.
If you like this podcast, you'll probably like that podcast, so go subscribe to that, whether it's called Web Zero or Network Age, depending on when this comes out.
First recording next week.
Cool. Cool.
And then I guess one thing I would say is like this is all seems maybe like futuristic and scary, but like it's literally already happening today. And if you just want to like see what's happening, just like hit us up, plan like a vacation, just like, I don't know, stop in, go to Mexico City, go to El Salvador, just like check it out. They're awesome places. You'll have fun.
Hell yeah.
Just like don't think about leaving your country necessarily. Just think about like living a more sort of vital life.
Love it, man. This was super exciting. You got me pumped. I appreciate it, Phil.
Yeah.
Thanks, man. All right. Hit us up on Urbit. We're done.
Thanks.
That's good.